At 11:47 p.m., August 14, 1944, Sergeant Rodrigo Crisanto Villard, age 29, of the WWII Guerrilla Network's 3rd Mountain Platoon, crouched motionless inside a collapsed drainage ditch on the eastern slope of Mount Arayat in Pampanga Province, Luzon, Philippines. 17 Imperial Japanese soldiers from the 14th Area Army's 10th Independent Garrison Unit, moving in a contracting perimeter no more than 60 meters away, closing from 3 directions to Kogon grass so thick it hissed against their uniform buckles in the windless midnight air. What Rodrigo Villard held in his right hand was not a rifle, not a bolo knife, not a captured Japanese Arasaka. It was a Karambit, a small claw-shaped blade barely 4 inches long, its handle worn smooth from 2 years of daily use, its recurved edge sharpened that evening on the underside of a river stone until it could catch moonlight the way broken glass does. The nearest Japanese patrol checkpoint, where a radio operator could summon reinforcements, stood exactly 340 meters northeast along the irrigation trail, a distance Villard knew by count of footsteps, because he had walked it 11 times in daylight as a civilian carrying water jars. In the next 4 minutes and 30 seconds, either the Japanese garrison would locate and execute the guerrilla in the ditch, or 17 soldiers would cease to report back to that checkpoint, and the Imperial Command Post at San Fernando would spend the next 6 days convinced that an American Special Operations unit of at least 30 men was responsible. The most dangerous man in Pampanga Province that August was not a decorated officer, not a commando trained at Bataan, not an American OSS operative. He was a former sugarcane field hand who had taught himself to fight in absolute darkness using a tool that every Japanese military analyst, every Allied liaison officer, and every senior WWII commander had publicly dismissed as a peasant's kitchen ornament. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The myth around Rodrigo Villard did not begin with a battle citation. It began with a rumor, the kind that spreads through guerrilla networks the way fire moves through dry nipa, quickly, low to the ground, and in every direction at once. The rumor said a man in Pamco's Central Plain had cleared a Japanese patrol billet with no rifle and no machete. The rumor said he moved like a crab, close to the earth, and that he used a blade the size of a man's palm and a grip that even other guerrillas had never seen. The rumor said the Japanese had found 7 bodies arranged so precisely, so quietly, that the sergeant of the guard had initially logged them as a medical emergency, heart failure, possibly, before someone turned one of the bodies over. The documents that survive from this period are fragmentary. WWII records from Pampanga, portions of which were collected post-war by Filipino historians and partially cross-referenced against declassified Japanese 14th Area Army garrison reports, describe a series of patrol ambushes in the Mount Arayat corridor between June 1944 and February 1945. In at least 4 of these incidents, the garrison reports note, no gunfire heard, no grenade detonations confirmed, personnel losses unaccounted for over a period of 2 to 4 hours. That kind of entry in a Japanese military log represents something genuinely unusual, a level of silence that standard ambush doctrine does not produce. This is the story of the night that silence became legend. Rodrigo Crisanto Villard was born in 1915 in the municipality of Magalang, Pampanga, a flat agricultural lowland province where the principal industry was sugarcane and the principal employer, before the war, was the centralized hacienda system that had organized Filipino peasant labor for generations. He was the 3rd son of a sugarcane cutter who also did seasonal work in a rice mill. He received 6 years of formal education at a Catholic parish school, enough to read and write Kapampangan and Tagalog, and to perform the arithmetic necessary to manage a farm ledger. He was not, by any institutional measure, a soldier. He had never served in the Philippine Commonwealth Army. He had not been part of the USAFFE forces that fought and collapsed at Bataan and Corregidor in 1942. When the Japanese occupation began, Villard was 26 years old and working as a Palay buyer's assistant, traveling between barrios on a bicycle, weighing rice and recording prices in a cloth-covered notebook. His skills, such as they were at the start of the occupation, were practical and agricultural. He could navigate the entire Mount Arayat corridor in darkness, every irrigation ditch, every collapsed dike, every sugarcane field boundary, because he had walked those routes for years collecting rice prices. He knew which drainage channels stayed dry in August and which flooded. He knew where kogon grass grew thick enough to conceal a man lying flat. He knew the smell of Japanese cigarettes, a slightly different burn than American or local varieties. And he had learned, by habit long before the occupation, to pay attention to small sensory details the way any man does who earns a living moving through landscapes on foot. He joined the WWII, the People's Anti-Japanese Army, in early 1943, roughly 8 months after the organization formally consolidated its resistance activities in central Luzon. He joined not through any dramatic recruitment, but through the quiet mechanism of necessity. The Japanese garrison at San Fernando had begun enforcing rice quotas in his barrio with increasing violence, and the choice between collaboration and resistance had narrowed to the point where neutrality was no longer survivable. When Velarda arrived at the 3rd Mountain Platoon's staging area near the lower slopes of Mount Arayat, the platoon commander, a former schoolteacher named Lieutenant Esteban Quizon, assessed him the way experienced guerrilla officers assess every new recruit in terms of what the man had and what the unit needed. What Velarda had was a bicycle, a notebook, a karambit on his belt, and detailed knowledge of the ground. What the unit needed, at that moment, was all 4 of those things. The karambit on Velarde's belt drew immediate commentary. In the Philippines, the karambit is not an exotic weapon. It has deep roots in both Malay and indigenous Filipino martial traditions, and smaller versions have been used as agricultural tools, particularly for harvesting and cutting work in confined spaces for centuries. But what the other guerrillas noticed was not the blade itself so much as the way Velarde wore it, and the way he handled it during idle moments. The grip he used was inverted, blade curving backward along the forearm rather than projecting forward from the fist, and when he practiced his draws against the air, the movement was rotational, tight, economical, nothing like the wide chopping arcs of bolo or machete work. "He fights like he's picking sugarcane," one platoon member told another, and the comparison was not a compliment. It meant small, repetitive, close to the ground. Not the work of a soldier. Lieutenant Quizon gave Velarde a rifle, an aging Springfield 903 with a cracked stock that had been repaired with wire, and put him on courier duties and reconnaissance routes. Those were appropriate roles for a man with Velarde's navigation knowledge. For the first several months he fulfilled them without incident or distinction. The dismissal, when it became explicit, came from a source with more authority than Quizon's platoon. In late 1943, the WWII received a brief coordination visit from a Filipino officer who had been operating with American-backed guerrilla networks in northern Luzon. This officer, whose name appears in post-war accounts as Captain Marcos Dizon, toured several Pampanga units and offered tactical assessments. When he observed Velarde's karambit practice during a rest period, Dizon's response was direct. Blade weapons of that size and type, he told Quizon, were decorative at best and suicidal at worst in any engagement where the enemy possessed rifles and numerical superiority. Close-quarters combat was the domain of the bolo, the entrenching tool, or the captured Japanese bayonet. Karambit fighting was a folk practice, not military technique. Quizon did not disagree. Velarde said nothing. What Velarde had understood, however, through not formal training but through the specific attention of a man who thinks carefully about problems, was something that Captain Dizon's tactical framework did not account for: the difference between a weapon that is effective in combat and a weapon that is effective in the particular kind of combat produced by a single guerrilla, alone, in absolute darkness, needing to work in total silence, from an arm's length or less. A rifle fires. A bolo swings wide and requires backswing clearance. A bayonet thrusts and must be withdrawn with force. Every one of those actions produces noise. Every one of them requires physical space. In a drainage niche 50 centimeters wide. In kogon grass so dense it catches on a man's shoulders. In complete darkness where the only navigational information is what your hands and feet can read from the ground. None of those weapons was as functional as something 4 inches long that rotated in a confined arc and could be drawn without raising the elbow above the shoulder. Velarde had not read any treatise on close-quarters combat. He had simply thought about the problem for a long time, on many nights lying in drainage ditches counting Japanese footsteps. By mid-1944, the strategic situation in central Luzon had evolved in ways that made the corridor around Mount Arayat simultaneously more dangerous and more important as a guerrilla operating zone. The Japanese 14th Area Army, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who assumed command in October 1944, maintained garrison units throughout the Central Plain, whose primary function was resource extraction and population control, enforcing rice quotas, suppressing resistance networks, maintaining lines of communication between Manila and the northern Luzon highland positions that would eventually form Yamashita's Shobu Group defense line. The garrison forces were not elite infantry. They were mixed-quality occupation troops, some veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns, many conscripts and rear echelon soldiers whose combat experience was limited. Their tactical doctrine for dealing with guerrilla activity followed standard Japanese counterinsurgency patterns: punitive sweeps, collective punishment of communities suspected of harboring resistors, and systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure to deny guerrillas their logistic space. The particular garrison unit operating in the San Fernando-Arayat corridor, the 10th Independent Garrison, had approximately 340 personnel at the time of the events described here, divided among a main billet at San Fernando and 4 smaller patrol bases covering the roads and irrigation routes of the central Arayat approach. Their patrol schedule was semi-regular, variable enough to prevent simple pattern analysis, but constrained by the same terrain that constrained everyone moving through that corridor, which meant that any man who knew the ground well enough could predict, within a range of 3 or 4 routes, where a given patrol was likely to operate on a given night. Villard had been tracking those patrols, recording routes and timing in the same cloth-covered notebook he had once used for rice prices, for approximately 14 months. The guerrilla situation in Pampanga in 1944 was complex in ways that post-war histories often simplify. The Hukbalahap was not a unified, well-supplied fighting force. It was a network of semi-autonomous local units with inconsistent access to weapons, food, and communication. The 3rd Mountain Platoon at this period had 11 active fighters, 2 of whom were recovering from illnesses that limited their mobility. Total serviceable firearms, 7. Total ammunition, roughly 60 rounds per operational rifle, with no reliable resupply anticipated before October. In that context, every operation had to be measured not only by tactical outcome, but by the cost and irreplaceable ammunition and the risk to the network's ability to continue functioning. This was the condition that gave Villard's approach, silent, ammunition-free, leaving no ballistic evidence, a practical value that the dismissive Captain Dyson had not considered. A guerrilla force that cannot resupply ammunition cannot afford to announce itself with rifle fire every time it needs to remove a Japanese patrol from a critical route. The mathematics of scarcity had made Villard's noise discipline not an aesthetic choice but a logistical one. The other element of context that is essential to understanding the August 14 operation is what had happened 3 weeks earlier, on July 24, 1944. On that night, a 3-man Hukbalahap patrol from the 3rd Platoon, attempting to cross the irrigation trail near the Arayat eastern slope, had been intercepted by a Japanese patrol. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes and cost the guerrillas 2 dead and 1 wounded, half the patrol's strength, plus 1 rifle and its remaining ammunition. The surviving guerrilla, a young man named Felix Bautista, reached the platoon's base position after dawn, badly dehydrated, and reported that the Japanese patrol had been lying in static ambush in the Kogon grass and had waited until the guerrilla patrol was within 30 meters before opening fire. Lieutenant Quaisen's assessment of that contact was that the Japanese were conducting deliberate counter-guerrilla ambushes along the most likely crossing points, a change from their earlier, more predictable linear patrol routes. This assessment was correct. The 10th in the garrison had received guidance from the San Fernando command post, following a June intelligence report suggesting increased guerrilla activity in the Arayat corridor, to deploy ambush pairs in small groups in static positions along known guerrilla movement routes. What this meant in practice was that the Japanese were now using the guerrillas' own technique, stillness, concealment, patience, against them. And against that technique, a rifle-based response was severely disadvantaged. A guerrilla walking into a static Japanese ambush would encounter fire from the front and flank simultaneously, at close range, with no cover and no warning. Bautista had survived only because he was slightly behind the lead man when the ambush opened. Quaisen's platoon needed someone to clear the Arayat eastern crossing route before the larger resupply movement scheduled for August 16, a movement of critical food and medical supplies from a cache in the lower mountain to a barrio network in the central plain. If that crossing was still covered by Japanese static positions on the night of August 16, the resupply would either fail or result in losses the platoon could not absorb. The option of sending a rifle squad to sweep the crossing was discussed and rejected. Too loud, too likely to alert the San Fernando garrison and trigger a response before the resupply could be completed. The option of simply rerouting the resupply around the crossing added 4 kilometers of travel through open paddies with no cover, unacceptable given the wounded man and the weight of the supply load. Lieutenant Quizen, after an unusually long silence during the evening planning meeting, looked at Rodrigo Villard and asked him a single question. "How many men do you think are on that crossing route tonight?" Villard consulted his notebook. He said, "Between 12 and 18, based on the patrol size patterns he had observed over 14 months. Probably one static element of 6 to 8 on the crossing itself, and 2 or 3 mobile elements working the approach routes." Quizen asked, "Can you clear it?" Villard said he could try. He asked for one thing: to go alone. The argument that followed that meeting was, by the accounts of surviving participants collected in post-war oral history interviews, prolonged and heated. The platoon's senior fighter, a former USAFFE corporal named Domingo Laxon, made the case against sending Velarde in simple terms. One man with a Karambit against a confirmed Japanese position was not a tactical operation. It was a suicide mission dressed up in optimism. Laxon proposed instead that the platoon accept the delay, move the resupply date back 5 days, and spend the interim reconnoitering an alternate route through the paddies that might be workable with careful timing. A guerrilla named Arturo Mendez, who had trained briefly with the Northern Luzon unit before transferring south, agreed with Laxon and added a tactical point. The Japanese static positions, if properly set up, would have overlapping fields of observation. A single man moving through them on the ground would almost certainly be heard or seen before he reached the first position, let alone the others. Villard did not argue the tactical merits in the meeting. He said very little. What he said was that he had been through that crossing on foot, on his belly, at night, 11 times in the previous 8 months, and that he understood the ground there in a specific way that was difficult to explain in a planning session, but that would be evident to anyone who had spent the same amount of time on it. He said he was not proposing to fight through the position. He was proposing to remove individual soldiers from it one at a time, without alerting the others. Laxon's response to this was blunt. Removing soldiers from a static position one at a time was exactly what required silence and control that no single man with a small blade could maintain against alert, armed infantry. Quizen overruled the objections. His reasoning, as he later described it to a journalist collecting resistance stories in 1948, was not that he was confident in Velarde's plan. It was that he had run out of better options, and that Villard had earned the right to be heard by 14 months of producing accurate intelligence and demonstrating the kind of physical courage that shows itself, not dramatically, but repeatedly, in small acts over time. Villard left the base position at 9:14 p.m. on August 14, 1944. He carried no rifle. He carried no grenades. He carried the Karambit, a short bolo at his left hip for emergencies, enough food for 2 days, a water container, and his cloth notebook. He wore no boots. Bare feet on soft ground make less sound and provide better tactile information than any footwear. He moved southeast from the base position toward the Uriah eastern slope, following a route that ran parallel to the main irrigation trail, but stayed 30 meters inside the Kogon grass line. The last thing Domingo Laxon said to him before he left was, quietly and without malice, "This is the wrong tool, Rodrigo." Villard's response, equally quiet, "We'll see." By 10:20 p.m., Velarde had reached the observation position he had used on previous crossings, a section of collapsed dike immediately north of the main irrigation trail, overgrown with Kogon grass and wild bamboo, which offered a sightline across approximately 40 meters of the crossing zone, while keeping the observer below the grass line. He lay there for slightly under an hour, not moving, breathing through his mouth to reduce respiratory noise, reading the ground with every sense available to him. What he confirmed, piece by piece, was worse than the planning session's most conservative estimate. There were not 6 to 8 soldiers in a single static position on the crossing. There were, based on the cigarette ember locations he tracked across 90 minutes of observation, at least 3 separate groups totaling somewhere between 15 and 20 men, positioned in a rough arc that covered the crossing point and both approach trails. The Japanese had evidently anticipated that guerrillas would attempt to use the crossing in advance of a larger movement, possibly because the garrison's intelligence network had been better than the WWII knew and had deployed a reinforced ambush position rather than a standard patrol element. For 14 minutes, Villard processed what he was observing against the options available to him. Withdrawal was the rational choice. reporting back to Quaison that the crossing was more heavily covered than anticipated, delaying the resupply, seeking an alternate route. That was what a reasonable man with a reasonable grip on his own survival would do. The resupply delay was costly but survivable. Proceeding against 17 or more armed soldiers alone in conditions where a single alert would result in immediate concentrated rifle fire at close range was by any objective measure not survivable. Villard did not withdraw. The reason he gave, years later, when pressed by a historian who was trying to understand his decision, was both tactical and matter-of-fact. He had looked at the positions of the three groups and identified that the arc they formed had a gap, a section of the Kogon grass approximately 12 meters wide on the southern side of the crossing where no cigarette ember had appeared during his entire observation period. That gap existed because the ground there was slightly lower than the surrounding area, prone to standing water after rain, uncomfortable for men lying in static ambush positions for extended periods. The Japanese had, quite sensibly from their own comfort standpoint, avoided it. That gap was the edge of the drainage ditch where Velarde now lay, and the drainage ditch ran, with one slight jog, all the way to within arm's reach of the nearest Japanese position, the group of 6 whose embers he had located closest to the crossing center. He did not decide to fight 17 soldiers. He decided to enter the ditch and see how close he could get to the first position without being detected. That was the only decision he made at that moment. Everything after it would be contingent. At 11:31 p.m., he slid forward from the observation position into the drainage ditch on his stomach. The ditch was approximately 60 centimeters wide and 40 centimeters deep at the position where he entered it. The bottom was soft, damp soil. Not standing water exactly, but saturated ground that gave slightly under his hands and knees with a sound like a very slow breath. He moved at approximately 2 meters per minute. At that speed, which is far slower than most people can force themselves to go in a high-stress environment, his body displaced almost no Kogon grass, created almost no audible disturbance, and produced a movement signature indistinguishable from the settling of waterlogged soil. He reached the first Japanese position at 11:43 p.m. The first soldier was alone, separated from his 2 nearest companions by approximately 4 meters of Kogon grass. He was lying on his right side, his Arisaka rifle across his forearm, facing northwest, facing, in other words, roughly away from the direction of the ditch from which Villard was approaching. He was not asleep. His cigarette had been extinguished some time in the previous 20 minutes, and his breathing, which Villard could hear at less than a meter, was the shallow, alert breathing of a man trying to stay awake in a static position after dark. Villard had, by his own later description, rehearsed this moment many times in his mind during the preceding 14 months of observation work. Not as fantasy or anticipation, but as problem-solving, the same way a carpenter measures a piece of wood several times before cutting, building the action into muscle memory before the task is real. The Karambit's grip, inverted along the inner forearm with the blade curving backward toward the elbow, is optimized for one specific mechanical purpose: a tight inward rotation of the wrist that draws the edge across a surface in a controlled, close arc. The action requires minimal backswing. It requires no space behind the elbow. It can be completed with the arm barely extended from the body. Most importantly, it can be initiated from a prone position, from a crawl, from any posture that allows the right hand to reach the target, which is to say, from the floor of a drainage ditch. At 11:47 p.m., Rodrigo Velare's right hand came out of the ditch. What follows in the next 4 minutes and 27 seconds, a duration established by Velarde's own post-action account, which he gave to Quaison at dawn and which is corroborated at the broad level by the Japanese garrison report filed 6 days later, is one of the most precisely documented close-quarters engagements in Philippine guerrilla records, not because anyone witnessed it, but because Velarde was a man who had spent 14 months training himself to notice and remember details, and because the physical evidence left behind was systematic precision. The first soldier died without a sound that traveled more than 2 feet. Villard did not pause to confirm. He had thought about confirmation during those 14 months too, and concluded that at this range, in this sequence, confirmation was a luxury that cost time he did not have. He moved immediately to the left, along the ditch floor, tracking the next ember location from memory. The second soldier had heard something, not the action itself, but the slight displacement of Kogon grass as Villard had moved into the ditch approach 3 minutes earlier. He was propped on one elbow, head raised slightly, scanning the grass with the careful attention of a man who is not certain he heard what he thought he heard. He was looking almost exactly toward Velarde's approach vector, which should have been fatal. What saved Velarde, and what he later said he had thought about many times since, was the Japanese soldier's eyes. Human night vision, unassisted, cannot detect a movement at 1 meter per minute against a background of grass in a drainage ditch. The visual system is tuned for faster movements, for displacement, for contrast. The soldier was looking directly at the space where Velarde was, and seeing nothing that his brain registered as a threat, because there was nothing moving fast enough to register as a threat. By the time that changed, the distance was under 1 meter. The second soldier died at 11:49 p.m. Velarde lay still for 90 seconds. This was the most important 90 seconds of the entire operation, not because anything happened, but because nothing happened, and that nothing confirmed that the two actions had been undetected. From the second position, the ditch curved slightly south, toward the larger of the three groups, the main ambush element that Velarde estimated at 8 to 9 men, positioned along the crossing trail itself. This was the difficult part. A group of 8 to 9 men in close proximity creates a completely different sensory environment than two isolated soldiers 4 meters apart. They have collective hearing. They have the social friction of being awake together. Small sounds like shifting weight, whispered exchanges, the involuntary rustles of men who cannot stay perfectly still, that, paradoxically, can mask a single intruder's approach by filling the auditory space with familiar low-level noise. But it also means that any action taken against one member is immediately proximate to the others. Velarde spent 8 minutes in the ditch between the second position and the main group, not moving forward, assessing. What he found was that the main group was not a single cohesive element. 3 of the men had shifted south from the main trail, possibly to relieve themselves or to find slightly drier ground, and were now separated from the remaining 5 by approximately 7 meters of kogon. The ditch ran between these two subgroups. He took the 3 separated men first, working north to south along the ditch floor over a period of 11 minutes, during which one man in the main group called out a low, questioning phrase in Japanese, the equivalent of "everything all right," and received no answer from the 3 men who were no longer capable of answering. After a pause of approximately 15 seconds, the same man called out again. Velarde was, at that moment, 4 meters from the nearest man in the main group of 5, pressed flat against the south wall of the ditch. The man who had called out said something to his companions. There was low discussion. Gilaver could not understand Japanese, but he had learned to read tone across 2 years of proximity, and the tone he was hearing was the specific mixture of confusion and uncertainty that precedes a decision to investigate, not the sharp, immediate action tone of an ambush sprung or an alarm raised. One man stood up. Velarde had thought about this moment too, not this exact moment, but the category of moment. One man detaching from a group to check on something, moving in the dark, separated from his companions by the kogon grass. He waited in the ditch as the man moved south, past the ditch line, stepping over it without looking down, the drainage ditch, in the dark, half full of shadow, invisible to a man whose eyes had not adjusted after looking at the sky while standing. The man was 2 steps past the ditch when Velarde came out of it. There was a brief sound, a sharp exhale, truncated, that the remaining 4 men in the main group heard. One of them said something sharp, a command. Another made a sound of acknowledgement. There were the sounds of men rising from prone positions, rifles being raised. Velarde was already back in the ditch. He lay motionless for 4 full minutes while the 4 remaining men from the main group conducted what amounted to a confused search, moving cautiously into the area where their companions had been, finding what they found, calling in low, urgent voices to the other 2 positions to the north. By the time the men from the third group, a pair Velarde had not yet approached, moved south toward the crossing, Velarde had already repositioned along the ditch to the north. The ensuing 22 minutes, which represent the highest risk and most technically complex portion of the operation, produced the remaining action by an inverse logic. The Japanese soldiers, now aware that something had happened but not what or from where, had consolidated in groups of 2 and 3, moving together, covering each other's flanks, which ordinarily would have made any approach far more dangerous. What it had also done, however, was bring them off the static positions they understood and onto ground they were now navigating in confusion. In darkness, in a terrain grid that Rodrigo Villard had memorized in better detail than any map they possessed, he did not chase them. He moved to positions he knew they would pass, positions where the drainage ditched intersected the natural movement lines of men trying to consolidate in the dark. The corner of the Kogan stand with the only solid footing was along the north edge, the section of the irrigation trail where the bank narrowed to a single file, and he waited. The final two soldiers encountered Villard at 12:11 a.m., not because he had found them, but because in the dark and confusion, moving south to reach the trail they knew, they walked directly along the ditch line. At 12:14 a.m., Rodrigo Velarde lay flat in the drainage ditch, breathing carefully, listening to the silence of the Arayat eastern slope. 17 soldiers had entered that position. The number who would report back to the San Fernando checkpoint was 0. He rested for 22 minutes. He washed his hands in the standing water at the ditch's southern end. He checked the Karambit's edge. He was, by his account, still functional, though he would resharpen it the following morning. He recovered 6 Japanese rifles, which he cached under a section of collapsed dike he marked with a bend in the Kogon grass. Recoverable by daylight, he walked back to the platoon base, arriving at 2:40 a.m. Lieutenant Quizin was awake. Domingo Laxon was awake. Most of the platoon was awake. They had heard nothing from the crossing direction, which was itself alarming enough to keep men from sleeping. Villard gave his report standing up in the dark, using the same flat, precise tone he had developed for delivering reconnaissance information. He said the crossing was clear. He said there were 6 rifles cached at a marked position. He said the resupply movement on August 16 should have no interference from the 10th Garrison, at least for the next several days while the garrison assessed what had happened. Laxon asked him how many. Villard said 17. There was a silence in the platoon base position that several surviving participants later described as genuinely disorienting. The silence of men whose existing framework for what was possible had just been presented with information it could not immediately process. Quizin said nothing for a moment. Then he asked one question. Any shooting? Velarde said no. The Japanese 10th Independent Garrison filed its incident report on August 20, 1944, 6 days after the event. The delay itself was informative. The garrison had spent nearly a week attempting to determine what had happened before committing to an official account. The report, portions of which were later captured and translated by American intelligence personnel, described the loss of a 17-man ambush element as contact with an estimated Allied Special Operations Unit, strength unknown, believed to include 30 or more personnel with advanced close-quarters capability. The report noted the absence of any gunfire or explosive detonation during the incident. It requested reinforcement of the San Fernando position and recommended suspension of static ambush operations in the Arayat corridor, pending further assessment of Allied capabilities. That request for suspension of static ambush operations was the most important tactical consequence of the night. The 10th Garrison, operating on the assumption that it had encountered a professional American or Allied commando unit with capabilities beyond standard guerrilla practice, became significantly more cautious in its patrol deployments in the corridor for the following 6 weeks. The resupply movement on August 16th crossed the Arayat eastern slope without incident. 3 subsequent Hukbalahap movements through the corridor in September also crossed without contact. Within the Hukbalahap network, the reaction was more complicated and more immediate. Domingo Laxon, who had argued most forcefully against the operation, spent the day of August 15 asking Villard detailed questions about the ditch approach, the timing intervals, the specific use of the grip in confined spaces. He asked these questions with the methodical attention of a man revising a technical understanding, not apologetically, but thoroughly. By the accounts of others in the platoon, Laxon spent the following 2 weeks drilling himself in the ditch movement technique, though he never used the Karambit itself, preferring his own bolo, which he began practicing in a modified close grip. The rifles recovered from the cache point became the platoon's primary resupply of the year. 6 Arisakas with ammunition nearly doubled the platoon's effective firepower and resolved the logistics crisis that had been building since the July 24th loss. Quizin noted in the platoon log that this represented the most significant material acquisition of the operational period, obtained at 0 cost in ammunition and 0 personnel casualties. Word of the operation moved through the Pampanga Hukbalahap network over the following weeks, in the way such things do, imprecisely, amplified in some details and compressed in others, but consistent in its core, a man with a Karambit, alone in a ditch, without firing a single shot. The number 17 was preserved accurately in most versions. The silence was preserved. The details of the ditch were preserved. What was added, as the story traveled, was the detail that Villard had been laughed at for his weapon, that officers had called it a kitchen tool, a peasant's ornament, and that he had said nothing in response, and that his silence before the operation and his results after it formed a single continuous statement that required no elaboration. That detail was not fabricated. It was accurate. It simply had not been framed that way by anyone who was present at the time. The senior Hukbalahap command in Pampanga received a formal account of the August 14 operation sometime in September 1944. The account was noted and filed. There was no formal citation. The Hukbalahap did not operate a formal citation system in the manner of regular armies. But Villard was promoted to the equivalent of sergeant major within the 3rd Platoon's informal rank structure, which primarily meant that his operational assessments were weighted differently in planning discussions than they had been before. Captain Marcos Dizon, who had made the dismissive assessment of the Karambit during his 1943 visit, was not present for any of this and is not recorded as having been informed of the specific operation. The historical record does not indicate whether he ever revised his technical opinion. The Japanese garrison at San Fernando continued to reduce its Arayat corridor presence through the fall of 1944, consistent with the broader strategic retrenchment of Yamashita's forces as American forces approached Leyte. Whether the August 14 incident was a material factor in that reduction or simply coincided with larger strategic pressures is impossible to determine with precision. The garrison's operational caution in the corridor in the weeks immediately following the incident, however, is documented in its own records. Villard conducted at least 3 additional solo night operations in the corridor between September 1944 and January 1945, all of which produced similar results. Silent engagements at close range, no ammunition expended, Japanese patrol elements removed from key routes, though none on the scale of August 14. The post-war interviews that documented these operations are less detailed than Villard's own account of the August event, and some of the numbers involved are uncertain. What the pattern establishes clearly is that August 14 was not an anomaly or a fortunate convergence of circumstances. It was the demonstration of a capability that Villard had been developing methodically for 2 years, and that he then applied consistently, as conditions permitted, for the remainder of the campaign. By early 1945, as American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf and the liberation campaign in Luzon began in earnest, the 3rd Mountain Platoon had been significantly rebuilt. New recruits, some captured equipment, better communication with Allied forces. Villard's role evolved with the changing situation. He began conducting liaison work between the Hukbalahap elements and advancing American units, serving as a guide for American patrols through the Arayat terrain he knew better than anyone in the region. American soldiers who worked with him in this period noted in their own letters and reports the detail that stands out even across 70 years of historical distance. He carried a small, curved blade on his belt and seemed to consider it his primary working tool rather than any of the weapons they offered him, though he handled their rifles and carbines with professional competence when the situation required it. One American soldier, a sergeant from the 37th Infantry Division, wrote in a letter home that his Filipino guide moved through jungle like he was part of it. I never heard him. You'd look back and he'd just be there. Rodrigo Crisanto Villard survived the war. He returned to Pampanga in 1945 and eventually settled in the municipality of Mexico, in the same province, where he worked for many years in agricultural land management, a role that put his navigational knowledge and his facility with detailed record-keeping to use in peacetime applications, not entirely unlike the ones that had preserved his life during the occupation. He gave his first recorded interview about the war in 1948 to a journalist from a Manila newspaper compiling resistance stories. He gave subsequent interviews in 1952 and 1967, the latter to a Filipino historian working on a comprehensive oral history of the Hukbalahap movement in central Luzon. In all of these interviews, Villard described the August 14, 1944 operation in the same flat, precise tone his platoon members remembered from the pre-dawn report at the base: systematic, detail-oriented, without embellishment. When interviewers pressed him for the emotional dimension of the experience, how it felt, what he was thinking, how he managed the fear, he consistently redirected to tactical considerations. What was the ground like? What the Japanese were doing? What the Japanese were doing? What the ditch allowed and what it didn't? The emotion, if present, was not the story he considered worth telling. He kept the Karambit. It appears in photographs taken of him in 1967, still on his belt, the same worn grip, the same small recurved blade that every officer who looked at it had described as inadequate. By that point, nobody who had seen him use it described it that way anymore. The broader significance of what Villard had developed and demonstrated is worth stating clearly, because it is the kind of significance that formal military history tends to undercount. He had solved a specific operational problem: how to clear a covered route in silence, at night, without ammunition, against superior numbers, using an approach that no institutional training program had produced and no tactical doctrine had anticipated. He had solved it through systematic observation, careful preparation, deep knowledge of specific terrain, and a technical discipline applied with a tool that his entire institutional environment had told him was wrong for the purpose. The lesson was not that the Karambit is superior to the rifle. The lesson was narrower and more precise, and Villard articulated it himself in the 1967 interview with a clarity that the historian noted as remarkable for its specificity. Every weapon is the wrong weapon somewhere. Every weapon is the right weapon somewhere else. I knew my somewhere else better than they did. The 3rd Mountain Platoon's operational record for the Arayat Corridor period, the months between mid-1944 and early 1945, represents some of the most effective guerrilla interdiction work in Pampanga during the occupation, measured by routes kept open, resupply operations completed, and Japanese patrol effectiveness degraded in the target area. That record was built on many contributions, but it was anchored by the events of a single night in August, when a man with a 4-inch blade and 14 months of notebook entries and a precise understanding of how slow a man needed to move to be invisible, lay down in a drainage ditch and began solving a problem that 17 armed soldiers had no framework to understand was happening to them. Lieutenant Esteban Quizon, who survived the war and became a teacher again in post-war Pampanga, was asked in a 1955 interview what he remembered most about Rodrigo Villard as a soldier. He said he remembered the silence most, not the silence of the ditch on the night of August 14, which he hadn't been present for, but the silence in the planning sessions, the silence while other men argued and Villard sat with his notebook in his lap, and the silence after operations, when Villard gave his reports in the same calibrated tone, regardless of what had happened. He was not a silent man because he had nothing to say, Quizon said. He was silent because he had already thought about whatever you were going to say, and he was waiting for you to finish. Domingo Locsin, who had said, "This is the wrong tool, Rodrigo," on the night of August 14, lived into his 80s in Pampanga and is recorded as having taught a modified version of Villard's ditch approach technique to young men in his barrio during the 1950s, when Huck activity flared again and the old knowledge seemed relevant again. He never claimed credit for the technique. When he was asked about its origin, he always gave the same answer: Villarde. He figured it out. No one ever doubted him again.